My daughter is a vegetarian. My son is a bow hunter. With a chasm like that, how did we ever find harmony at the dinner table? We learned to tell and to listen to each other's stories. Stories protect us. Stories connect us, and stories heal us. So how did they protect us? Well, when those kids were teeny tiny, they crawled into my bed on either side, and under the covers, we opened book after book after book. One of the first books that we read was this book, Opposites, by Sandra Boynton. Had just a couple of words in pairs like bright, dull. A brilliant literary opposition. You know what opposition does for stories because you have enjoyed stories that have lots of opposition, and you've played with opposition when you were in grade school. Do you remember playing tug of war? Okay, I'm going to throw the imaginary tug of war out to you. Please grab a hold. And as I pull, lean towards me. Come on, come on, come on. Now you pull me, and I pull you, and back and forth we go, right? Can you see the tension in this rope? Well, that's what makes the game fun, and that's what makes stories fun. It doesn't, however, make life quite as much fun. And when the kids were little, mealtime began with, I want the pink cup. No, I want the pink cup. I am a brilliant mother. I took the pink cup away. The next meal was, I'll have the bozo spoon. No, I want the bozo spoon. And this was my life, over and over, this tug of war. And so I had that 30 minutes a day when those kids would come into bed and we would all be together, at least for those 30 minutes, on the same page, creating a template of togetherness. We did this by taking turns. When it was my daughter's turn, she read her book, Bear and Mrs. Duck. And we read that book every single day for 2 entire years. Not only were the words the same in the story, she actually asked the same questions every day. My son would go out of the bed, he'd go in the corner and play ball while I was reading her story. He didn't check out, but he found his own thing to do. And then when it was his turn, he'd crawl into the bed and we'd open the costume book. And we'd read about smoothing the tin foil, cutting out the cardboard, laying the cardboard on top, folding it up to make a sword. His sister would check out by playing her string games on the side. So each kid took turns with their story, but protected their sibling's story. That togetherness held us while we would make meals the next day, and we had this tug of war. As they got older, and my daughter was a vegetarian, I would make a meal for the family, separate out her vegetarian portion, and add meat to the rest of our family. Now, my son, his way of playing tug of war is to poke. And he would poke at his sister saying, Sissy, you know meat is the best part of the meal. You know you're going to eat meat again. She had her own way of playing tug of war, and she icily ignored him. Then we would come into bed, we'd be on that same page, reading stories again, creating a template of tolerance for each other's stories. One of the stories that I loved as the kids were little was Miss Rumphius, and it was picture books that helped to connect our family because they ask big questions. In Miss Rumphius, 3 things happen. First, Miss Rumphius goes far away and explores faraway lands. Then she comes home to live beside the sea. But there is a 3rd thing you must do, said her grandfather to Miss Rumphius. You must do something to make the world more beautiful. And she did. She filled her pockets with seeds, and everywhere she went, she was pouring seeds out of her pockets, leaving a path of lupin flowers in her wake. This lovely literary idea was not my daily experience at home. In my house, between my daughter's room and my son's room, a wall divided them. And on this wall, when my son was about 12, he would hang the heads of animals he had harvested in the woods. On the other side of the wall, my daughter strung beads to make necklaces she sold to support the local animal shelter. I don't know if it was because she got emboldened by selling those necklaces, but she became sort of a zealot in our home and named products that were evil to animals. Detergent, peanut butter, candy, they all had to go. Meanwhile, my son is out in the woods, and he is having great adventures, and he comes home to regale us with these adventures, and he is bloody and muddy and savage. This zealot and savage that my children went through had to do with because they were following Miss Rumphius's advice of going far, far away to explore the edges of who they essentially were before they could come home to answer the question, what will I do to make the world more beautiful? My daughter became a vegetarian when she was 12 years old. At school, they were studying the Drey's eye test performed on rabbits, and she found it unbelievably cruel. And she said, here's this rabbit that has no voice. And she decided to become the voice for that rabbit, and she hasn't eaten meat since that day. My son was born a hunter. He played hunting games as a child, and as he grew older and went into the woods, I would ask him, he'd say, Mom, killing is the hard part. You watch this animal that's having a great time in the woods, and it's because of what I just did that that animal died. But you see, he understands that if he is to sustain his life or those in our family, he's willing to take responsibility for the life that is sacrificed. He's the kind of person that if there's a car broken down on the side of the road, he stops. How can I help? He wants to lend a hand. In his very nature, he feeds people. And so I began to see this wall between my two children's rooms, not as much as a divide as a diving board. Think of an Olympian, okay? An Olympian is on that diving board, bouncing once, twice, 3 times, and then they soar skyward before they execute that perfect spike dive in the water. It's the resistance of the board that gives them their spring. And so a narrative developed between my children. One day we were at the grocery store, and my son reached into the cart and put the bag of Skittles back on the shelf. He says, "You can't have these, Mom, there's gelatin in them." It seems like this itty-bitty, teeny-tiny thing that could be overlooked. But isn't it the itty-bitty, teeny-tiny things that when someone sees our story and respects it, we feel loved? That's what he did for his sister, because he didn't want candy at his birthday party that his sister wouldn't enjoy. Several months after that, we were in Chicago, and a woman in Chicago was talking to my son. He's from Colorado. "Wow, you know a lot about animals," she said. "Yeah, well, you have to know a lot about animals if you're going to hunt them," he said. This poor woman from Chicago, she had probably never met a real live hunter in the flesh. "You kill them?" At this point, my son had lived with his vegetarian sister for a number of years, and he was used to this kind of argument. He pointed at her plate and he said, "Isn't that a hamburger that you're eating?" "Yes, but this came from the store," she said. Instead of my son speaking next, it was my daughter who stepped forward and spoke. "If you're going to eat meat, doesn't it make sense that you would take responsibility for the life that was sacrificed for your own?" My children had learned to come onto the same page, understanding that their stories related to one another. Board books protected their stories and helped them take turns. Picture books asked the big questions and connected them, and novels heal. I'm sure everyone is familiar with this book, Harry Potter, in which we have evil Snape and good Harry Potter. And I didn't quite accept that. And early in the story, I would begin asking questions about Snape. Why do you think he's so mean? I'd say to my kids. Mom, just some people are evil. And my kids refused to entertain that question. But J.K. Rowling, of course, had a different idea. And as the stories unfold, we learn more about Severus Snape. We understand that it's actually good Harry Potter's dad who humiliated Severus Snape as a child. And even my reluctant kids, when they heard that, when they heard his whole story, they had to extend compassion to Snape. See, what J.K. Rowling did was she took that evil, good, much like Zealot, Savage, and she put down this third leg of the whole story. And when we understand the whole story, we have compassion. 3 points determine a plane, right? So that three-legged stool, it doesn't rock. There's balance and foundation in the third leg. We saw this with my children as they grew. And one day I was sitting at the kitchen island with my daughter. She's sitting across from me. I'm unloading groceries. And I had bought a package of chicken for the rest of our family, and I plunk it down on the counter. And it lands, and as it lands, she heads back as if I had slapped her. And suddenly I no longer saw the zealot. I saw this girl who hurt for animals, who was being their voice. And as she asked for things to be removed from our house, she was just being the caretaker. That was her natural way of relating to animals. Likewise, with my son, I followed him into the woods, and he would point, and at the end of his finger, I saw my first red-tailed hawk. At the lake, he pointed, and I saw ribbons of water coming off the back of a beaver. See, I saw more animals in the woods with my son than anybody else. And I understood that it was because he had to get close enough to get a shot so that he could be the provider for our family. That wall, instead of dividing my children, it became the place they were each putting what was beautiful to them up and united them, providing the third leg between the balance in their life and that whole story. So much so that when they graduated, my son from high school, my daughter from college, they gave each other matching tattoos. Alaskan fish flipped so that they make the shape of the Yin and Yang symbol. The principle of Yin and Yang is that all things come together in inseparable but contradictory opposites. When I asked my daughter about that tattoo of her brother's, I said, "Why do you want to wear that yang energy of your brother on your side?" "I never want to be apart from him ever again," she said. See, she had found that whole story, understanding that that little piece of the yang energy of her brothers fulfilled her purpose like a diving board, allowing her to spring into the world and create what was beautiful. Stories protect us. Like those board books I read to my children as children, and they provided a ritual for us, a daily ritual that we could preserve that template of togetherness. Stories connect us. Stories ask big questions. What are you doing to make the world more beautiful? And sometimes when we're answering a question like that, we find ourselves on opposite sides of a game of tug of war. Or maybe when we're putting up what's beautiful to us, it's on the opposing side, but the same wall. Stories heal us. See, the crux of conflict is that we tend to think that everybody should see the world precisely the way we see the world. But stories come along and they seduce us into this surprising, aha, a way of thinking we never had before. And when my children understood Snape's whole story, they thought about him differently, just as they did each other. So I've told a story today. And now my big question is, in our nation of divides like black and white, blue and red, gay and straight, is it possible that we could come together and protect each other's stories so that we can take turns? Could we connect over each other's stories, understanding we might be on opposing sides of the same wall? And heal. Heal by putting down that third leg of stability onto our stories, so that even just for a few moments, we might come together on the same page. Thank you.